again? Okay. And why I'm interested in climate change in the first place, and why I am invested in trying to really understand and trying to find what we should be doing about climate change. So the presentation today is going to be based on my recent field visit to northwestern Nepal as a part of Sacred Himalaya Initiative's project looking at Kailash Sacred Landscape. So this is a project I'm currently involved in where I try to understand or look at the intersections of religion and ecology. So this is something different. But within this larger project, what I'm trying to do is trying to look at how climate change is affecting, or how climate change is unfolding in this particular region within the Kailash Sacred Landscape. So that being said, I actually study climate change because it is not only professionally but also personally important to me. As Alar mentioned earlier, I'm from the Everest region. I was born and raised in Kathmandu, but most of my time, or as a professional anthropologist, has been spent looking at Everest region, Sherpa culture, and the thought of what could have happened to the people who frantically rushed in the middle of the night with their belongings, and in particular to the young mother, really saddened me. It, in a way, angered me, and it left me desperately wanting to know why there was the rumor in the first place. So I found out later that a week before the first rumor, there was an information sharing workshop organized by an important regional institution in the popular Khumbu village, Namche Bazar. So this well-intentioned workshop was organized to share scientific findings of the expanding Imja Glacial Lake and the potential threat it posed to the communities living downstream. If it were to flood, the workshop showed that several villages would be swept away. And this included my mother's village, where as a child I spent holidays with my siblings. So upon further investigation, I saw that most of the participants in this workshop were non-residents or temporary residents. There were the organizers from Kathmandu, government officials, development professionals, guests, both Sherpas and non-Sherpas, and the local residents. In the following days, the scientific findings from the workshop had traveled throughout the region on a life of its own. So mobile phones and frequent movement of people further expedited this process, and by the time residents of my village heard it, the potential threat that was going to happen in the future from Imja Glacial Lake had now become this immediate one and unavoidable one. So the information about rising water level in the streams in northern Khumbu on that particular night was then relayed to southern Farak, where I come from, on those two occasions as the Imja Glacial Lake outburst flood, or GLOF. In order to understand why the people reacted to the rumor so quickly, one only needs to be in the region. The washed mountain slopes and impressions of the villages that once used to be in Farak remind the villagers constantly of previous Diksho that happened in 1985. So the thought of another glove happening was seriously alarming to the villagers. So experiences like this inspired my previous research studying Sherpa perceptions of climate change and institutional responses to climate change effects. The research found that the phrase climate change, the way we use it in the research community and the institutions use it in the Everest region, is used synonymously with GLOFs, or glacial lake outburst floods, for the Everest region. So this was largely due to institutions organizing climate change around GLOFs. And this only continued when the climate change adaptation policies in the country further described GLOF as the climate change threat to the Everest region, ignoring a wide range of effects. As a result, most of the studies and responses have also focused on melting of glaciers and GLOFs in this part of Nepal. So, and then I tried to investigate, okay, so what kind of climate change activity what are they doing? So what I found was that this here. So what 9, and then it just starts to decline. And this has not been updated, but this looks at explained by taking a closer look at the kinds of activities that were organized. So there were foot races, there were art competitions, there were workshops, and the famous, or less famous, cabinet meeting at the foot of Mount Everest. They were organized to draw international attention to the melting of glaciers so that the world would invest in saving the Himalayas, which was described by the Prime Minister as a global wealth. The Sherpas and Mount Everest as popular international attractions were premier choice for staging the climate change appeal at an international meeting, the Copenhagen Climate Summit in 2009. So other activities that were organized focused on raising awareness of climate change as we understand in the scientific community and institutional community among the local people, and also to build capacity of the local people in case there is a glacial lake outburst flood. So an unintended consequence of these activities was an uneven dissemination of scientific information at the local level. So while a group of Sherpas, particularly so men in their 30s and 40s living on the main trail to Mount Everest and who own lodges, were continually exposed to these institutional narratives of climate change, whereas the majority of the villagers were left out of the conversation, including, in my opinion, the most vulnerable ones. And the phrase climate change, needless to say, was foreign to many in Farak. So in the Everest region, what I saw were actions, agents, knowledges, institutions originating from different places but having direct and indirect effect on the locale. A lot of things were happening and a lot of entities and individuals were involved in doing something about climate change. And yet, for a female farmer in her 40s living in an off-road village, climate change, the phrase was still a foreign concept, but climate change effect in its multiple forms is still an everyday lived reality. She continues to sow her potato seed on the ground, not knowing if there will be too little or too much rain, and wondering if she will even make a profit that year. And she continues to laugh at the phrase climate change because she knows that this is the talk of men, something someone like her would not understand. So with these findings and observations from northeastern Nepal, I headed towards northwest to understand how climate change is unfolding there, but ultimately in an attempt to better understand the state of climate change knowledge and response in Nepal. So this is a picture taken from Simikot. Simikot is the district headquarters in Humla. So I focused my study in Humla district in northwestern Nepal, so moving from northeast to northwest. So the district is described as one of the most remote due to its location far from the capital city and the lack of road connectivity. The 2014 Human Development Report for Nepal shows that Humla has the highest human poverty index in the country at 49.26 and one of the lowest human development index at 0.376. The Human Development Index reflects the expansion of opportunities and choices, whereas the Poverty Index captures the denial as a result of income and capability deprivation in this report. So the high elevation and uneven geography of northern mountain region in Nepal result in different microclimatic conditions. Humla district also shares this characteristic, featuring subtropical, temperate, subalpine, alpine climate zones. The southern part of the district allows diverse flora and fauna to flourish, whereas the northern part is higher, colder, and drier, making it suitable for high-altitude life systems. So the socio-cultural layout of the district is generally described as comprising of the Khas-speaking Hindu people in the south and Tibeto-Burman-speaking Lama people in the north. So Simikot, prior to becoming the district headquarters, Simikot was a village of Khas-speaking Hindu people. It has now grown in size and includes people from throughout the district as well as outside the district. The Chief District Officer, CDO, heads the District Development Committee Office, DDC office, and the Local Development Officer coordinates the hundreds of development organizations that are registered in Simikot. The Local Adaptation Plan of Action, or LAPA, in the form of a report, is designed by the government of Nepal, and it includes activities to adapt to climate change at the local level. And most of the districts, including Humla in Nepal, have LAPA implemented today. So in Humla, the LAPA Implementation Office is also based in Simikot and works independently, but in collaboration with the CDO and LDO, so the district development level work. And this is important to point out, in my opinion, because climate change is still being implemented, or adaptation is implemented as a development effort or development activity. The LAPA Implementation Office in Humla has selected 5 out of 30 village development committees as places to work. A village development committee is the smallest governmental administrative unit, and these VDCs, or village development committees, were identified based on their socioeconomic vulnerability through consultation with local development officials, VDC secretary, ward representatives, top government officials, representatives from political parties, Dalit, indigenous people, and women, and various local service providers and intellectual social worker, profit-oriented organizations. So basically the point of me reading all of these different people and different groups of people is to show that the climate change adaptation, well, first of all, climate change effects and the challenges were identified by people recognized in this recognized as belonging to these various categories. In this case, the Dalits and the indigenous and the women are considered separate groups and treated separately. However, based on field observations, their voices are not presented and not heard in an evenly manner. So the lack of meteorological stations and reliable longitudinal data presents a challenge for the climate scientists engaged in climate change research. And this is not only the case of Humla, but also a larger issue in the Himalayas. So local observations, therefore, serve as an alternative to understand changes in the Himalayan microclimates, right? Onta and Resurrection in 2011. So studies show that in Burgaon, another village next to Simikot, hours away, hours of walking distance away, residents are uncertain of the onset and end of monsoon and timing of dry periods and snowfall. Lapa documents, although focus solely on extreme events as climate change effects, show that climate change effects are LAPA documents, although they focus solely on extreme events, they do show that climate change effects are happening at the local level. But again, it's narrow and limited in how it defines climate change effects. My informants mentioned that temperature has changed and weather patterns are unpredictable now. Which was also something I noticed in the Everest region. Dhamis and Dhangris, spiritual healers, shamans from Upper Simikot, shared with me that it is warmer now. They also described that greenhouses and electricity could be possible causes of local warming. In Chipra village, 4 hours of walking distance from Simikot, lack of rainwater and poor irrigation facility were seen as major problems. The impact of environmental changes were linked with food insecurity for the villagers in Chipra. So in order to learn about how climate change is unfolding in Humla, I began by identifying climate change stakeholders, regardless of whether they are local or non-local. So what I mean by that is whether they are residents, they were born and raised in the region, or they came in from somewhere else. I also looked at the stakeholders, institutional and non-institutional. I sought informants who are most likely to talk about climate change in its multiple forms to cover the varieties of understandings in this place. So, as I mentioned earlier, in Simikot, I was struck by what I heard from the informants. I was told that it was getting warmer compared to what it used to be like before. And the reason for the warming, they thought, was the electricity and the greenhouses that arrived in the villages in the last 5 years or so. The hydropowered electricity is generated from the streams nearby and is a much desired amenity, so the warming in this case is not a problem. The greenhouses are sheds, so basically a shelter made of thick plastic, where they grow diverse vegetables, varieties of vegetables. They were probably introduced by development organizations as these organizations did in other parts of mountain areas in the Himalayas to increase production of vegetables in the cold region. So both electricity and greenhouses are perceived to have contributed to the local warming. And in this case, the local warming is not problematic, but rather a side effect. The brightness of electricity and the heat captured in wind-blocking greenhouses are linked with increased warmth. When I shared this with a younger college-educated man, because I was so excited to find something new and something that I was not expecting, I shared this with a younger college-educated man, and he quickly dismissed that the electricity in greenhouses are not causing the warming. And he instead explained to me that the older folks don't know how actually the environment works, and they still talk about superstitions, he said. So then, I also visited this village, Chipra village, like 3 or 4 hours of walking distance, at least for me, from Simikot. And I was also pointed to the dry fields and the dying crops when talking about changes in weather patterns. A grandmother in Chipra village was worried and wondered what her son and daughter-in-law would feed the family since the crops were turning brown instead of green. A man in his 50s looked at the gushing Karnali River a few feet below his dry field and lamented about the water shortage that was going to make food scarce in his village.
In despair, he uttered, "What could be done? Nothing." He informed me that several projects have tried to help with a better water management system and improved channels that brought stream water from higher up to the villages below. But the streams were now dry and the problems continued, and the development organizations gone. So then, during my stay in Simikot, I also conducted a focus group meeting with residents of another village north of Simikot, Darafaya, which was listed as one of the highly vulnerable VDCs to climate change by the Local Adaptation Plan of Action, LAPA document. So in the meeting, I requested them to share an assessment of local issues, so initially to start the conversation. But then I gradually steered it towards environmental changes and what they were noticing and how they were being affected. So food scarcity and poverty were the salient topics of discussion in this 10-people group. They shared their disappointment in the subsidized food distribution process in Simikot. They said that the subsidized food did not reach people like them, who had many mouths to feed and lacked the means to purchase. They also said that the people closer to the government offices, who were economically better off, collected the subsidized food anyway and sold them at a higher rate in the local market. A father said with tears in his eyes that the best thing would be to end the supply of subsidized food once and for all. At least that way, he explained, social injustice would stop. So climate change professionals. So then I went and visited the climate change professionals working in Simikot, and they graciously shared their and very generously shared their experience of working in the villages with me. So the United Nations Development Program, UNDP, and the European Union, EU, and the UK Aid financially support the district-level LAPA implementation office, so including the office I visited. The LAPA documents prepared around 2013 with the participants from these various categories I mentioned earlier serve as the guideline to conduct local climate change adaptation activities. The professionals shared that the first phase of implementation was coming to an end, and the continuation of adaptation project depended on the availability of funds. This office had been working in selected villages in areas of agricultural production and food security, water resources and energy, public health, shelter, and physical infrastructure. So these were the various things that they were working on. And needless to say, the problems still exist and continue and maybe enhanced, but the funding is going to end, and it's not sure if the projects are going to continue or not. So then I met with some shamans, or in locally known as dhamis and dhangris, they're interpreters. So I asked shamans in Simikot about their gods and the needs they fulfill, just trying to learn about who the gods are and what roles they played. I was told about the Hilsa Devta, who lived in a patch of forest on a hill above the Simikot airport and below the military base. The villagers could go to this Devta, pollute it, make it angry, and get rain. If it rained too much, they could go to another Devta who lived in a rock above the village on an opposite hill and please it, and then get the desired change. So on a separate visit 1 month later, as our study team with my project trekked through a Lama village a couple of hours away from Simikot, we found ourselves in the middle of a ritual to stop the excessive raining, or predict when the raining was going to stop. This ritual was dedicated to a local god who was considered powerful and needed careful attention. The shaman roasted a ball of dough in the fire while the villagers sat around it talking and drinking. At the end of the ritual, the shaman took the dough that symbolized a frog, looked for signs very deeply and very carefully. The dough was then broken into 4 pieces and thrown in 4 directions. The shaman forecasted that the rain would stop that day around 5 p.m., and after 5 days there would be less rain. So in Humla, villagers see connections between local warming and the presence of greenhouses and electricity. There are also villagers who seek scientific knowledge to understand environmental changes. There are people who attempt at emotionally affecting local gods to effect desired weather changes. There are people who see the dry fields and worry about food security. There are people who see differential positioning within existing social structure as a limitation to climate change adaptation. And there are people who have institutionally informed perceptions and designed actions to deal with climate change. So Sigrid Nagoda, one of the researchers who studied climate change in Humla, showed that local vulnerability is socioeconomically differentiated at the household level in 4 Humla villages that she studied. Whereas the economically better off households thought facilities such as electricity and water are necessary items, the people on the bottom rung of the social ladder thought it was the inaccessibility to resources that needed to be eliminated. So it was not what was available, but how can we access. So depending on, even within the villages, depending on who you're talking to, what needs to be done is different. The idea is different. So Nisha Onta and Bernadette in the Resurrection in 2011 showed that the dependency and interconnectedness of Lama and Dalit men and women, 2 different ethnic groups in a different Humla village, define adaptation strategies, especially in view of growing food insecurity due to diminished crop yields under conditions of a warming climate. So again, there's another different kind of relationship that is going on and that needs to be taken into consideration. So this leads me to my conclusion. So this is what I noticed, but now I'm trying to say, okay, what can we learn from it? And what do we know about it? So in the case of Humla and how I see climate change unfolding, I think, and this is mostly because I'm still processing, it's going to be my preliminary conclusions and understanding of what is happening in Humla. But in this case, I do think it's important to, when talking about climate change and trying to understand how people know or what people know and what people respond to, I think it's also important to not only see the physical changes that are happening or the things that we see around us, but also try to explore the realm of the gods, because it is important to the local people. And secondly, I think it's also very important to make sure that we are reaching out to various stakeholders and trying to understand how they come from different angles and try to look at climate change in a way that makes sense to them. Then I also think the local what's happening in Humla should be understood not only in the local context, but also across multiple levels. So what happens at the national level in Kathmandu and how that influences or impacts what happens in Simikot, for example, at the local level, and also what happens at IPCC meetings, what happens in those climate summits internationally, how does that affect the local? I think it's also necessary to understand how climate change is unfolding at the local level. And what is extremely clear, at least for me, when I compare the situation of Humla with Everest region, is that there are different climate change contexts and different ways of understanding, and this heterogeneity, I think, should be considered in climate change studies. And the comparison and contrast helps us to better understand what is actually happening, but also opens up a lot of questions about what do we do about it. And finally, what I noticed when I was there this year And the way I see climate change unfolding, the different stakeholders I see today is not necessarily going to be the same 5 years from now, 10 years from now. So the climate change context itself is continuously changing. So how do we adapt? How do we as scientists or researchers trying to understand climate change also adapt to the change itself? I think that's another question that is revealed from this case. So with that being said, I'll leave it here and I'll take any questions you'll have.